Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. Buddha at the Gas Pump is an ongoing series of interviews with spiritually awakening people. I've done over 360 of them now, and if you'd like to check out previous ones, go to batgap.com and look under the past interviews menu, where you'll see them categorized in several different ways. You'll also see a donate button there, because this whole production is pretty much a full-time occupation for my wife and myself, and its support depends upon the appreciative listeners and viewers. So if you feel like supporting it, there's a donate button. My guest today is Rick Weinman, and I'll let Rick introduce himself in a minute, but I just want to say that I feel like I know Rick because I've seen him at AMA events for well over a decade. I don't know how long you've been seeing AMA, but I think I saw you there when your wife was pregnant with your son, who is now in his teens. And you know how it is when you're kind of in a crowd of people and certain people sort of stand out in a way. You notice them. There's something interesting about that person. I've always felt that about you. I always thought that there was something really interesting about your face and you and your wife together as a couple, and I never really knew anything about you, and it was only recently that I discovered that you were the founder and teacher of Vortex Healing, and I didn't really know what that was, but when I started reading your book, which unfortunately I've only read 60% of, I haven't finished it yet, I was very impressed from the outset, and you'll see why or you, the listeners, will see why as we proceed with this interview. One of the first things that jumped out at me in starting to read Rick's book was that he was providing a map of the territory of awakening, and I thought, oh boy, a map. I love the idea of maps of awakening, because I feel that as a spiritual culture and as a society at large, it would be really valuable for us to have a clearer understanding of what awakening is, all of its various facets and phases and stages and whatnot, for a number of reasons. One is that if we really understand what it is, that's an incentive to go for it, because it's something really worth experiencing. And secondly, it can eliminate a lot of confusion. There have been so many strange and off-the-track things indulged in by people in the name of spirituality and awakening and even religion, if we want to include those. And if we had a clearer understanding of what we're actually talking about, I think a lot of that strangeness could be bypassed, at least by those who have that understanding. They could save themselves a lot of time and trouble if they understood what it is that they were actually interested in. Let's get back to Rick. You dedicated your book to Neem Karoli Baba, Papaji, Merlin, and Amma. And in the next few minutes, I'd like you to explain why. But let's just kind of start with your story. You know, starting from, I guess, teenage years. You were rather unhappy and depressed, and you went to Europe, and you started to fast yourself to death, and take it from there.
Yeah, it's not the path I would sort of recommend for anyone. I've never advised that to a student, you know, go starve yourself and see what happens. But no, my father had died, and my mother had gone into a black hole, and I was graduating college, and you know, and I went to Europe and just hitchhiked around and slept in farmers' fields, and I wasn't headed anywhere. People would say, "Where are you going?" I said, "Well, where are you going?" And I said, "Well, we're going here." That's fun. And I lost all this weight. I was literally starving and out of body, and to the point where, like, one day I took a bite of a tomato at the end of the day, and I got a rush, like I just shot speed, and something said, you know, this isn't right. But I was, you know, I was basically avoiding all the trauma on the body, human, emotional level, but I found a certain freedom out there, and the rest of my path has been bringing that. It wasn't really, you know, awakening per se. It was like a taste of something, and then the rest of the path has been bringing that in, turning that into, having that turned into awakening, and still bringing that in to the, you know, the form in the local, you know, body, mind, consciousness.
Mm-hmm. And so after the fasting period,
Well, it wasn't fasting. It
it was
was just,
starving,
it was avoidance. It was
avoidance.
pure avoidance.
You didn't want to do anything so gross as eat.
Right. It would bring me down, and then I'd feel all the stuff I didn't want to feel. And,
Ah.
it was a long, very slow journey just getting back to being able to digest food after that.
Kind of reminds me of an old Stephen Wright joke. He said he broke up with his girlfriend because he wasn't really into meditation and she really wasn't into being alive.
Where I started to come back in, I was really living on the edge, doing odd jobs, day labor, living in a boarding house in the industrial section of Berkeley, sharing a room with a schizophrenic. And from there, I started making my way back bit by bit.
Yeah. So I guess you decided to, you didn't want to be a day laborer with schizophrenics all your life. You decided to get back into school.
Yep. Yeah, it just, felt like this wasn't very good long term, and I ended up, I had a dream in the middle of all that starving that, I could do science, I could save myself, right? So I sort of crammed myself into being able to get into a master's program with a teaching assistantship at the University of Arizona, and where I had by then lived for years before, and sort of my spiritual home. And so I went there, started that, and it just, I didn't have any of my heart in it. And at some point, it was sort of arranged from other levels for me to get out. Events were created, so to speak, and suddenly I was in a full-time healing practice.
Yeah, it's interesting how that happens,
Yep.
the best laid plans of mice and men.
Yes.
And what qualified you to be in a healing practice?
Well, I had both studied a healing art called Jinshin Jitsu, and I had developed my own sort of separate healing art. That was a form of aura balancing. I'd written a short book about it that got translated into 6 other languages. Very easy. 2 people can sit down, work with each other, kind of thing, and learn to just channel different kinds of energy. And I was pretty effective at it, even with those sort of elementary tools. Mm-hmm. And then it was years later that first Vortex Healing came along.
And so where did you go from the healing practice? How did you transition from that to the next thing?
Well, when Vortex Healing came along, this sort of wild experience where I sort of learned to clear spaces, and I would just sort of expand my field through a space, clearing stuff out. It wasn't very efficient and kind of time consuming. And one day I sort of realized that there was some past life connection I had to some energy, and I could pull on this energy and just intend it to go clear a room. And it would do it. It could clear the whole house and do it much better, much faster. And one day as I was doing that, it was as if I pulled open this trapdoor, and suddenly I was standing in the middle of this interdimensional vortex with my feet on the ground and the rest of me out in space somewhere. And this voice started to talk to me and told me that I had studied this in past lives and it was time for me to reconnect to it. And that was the voice of Merlin, not Merlin, the magician, King Arthur Merlin. It was the avatar that actually was at the root of that lineage. And so I started to work with that and started to have these amazing healings that I knew I wasn't capable of before. I went to India and saw Papaji, and he would direct me to people. One person had acute leukemia, and after 3 sessions, all of his blood indicators cleared up. This kind of stuff, and people were wanting to learn it. I didn't even know how I was doing it, really. And I asked Merlin inside, I said, can I teach this? And he said yes, and that was the beginning of teaching that.
So all kinds of people are channeling all kinds of people, and I've interviewed some. And there are people who say they're channeling Saint Germain or, Mother Mary or Mary Magdalene or any number of other disembodied entities. And some of these people strike me as crazy, and so, there's the Ramtha thing, and some of them strike me as egotistical, And you don't strike me as either of those. You seem very genuine and coherent and sane. And yet one might ask, you know...
As do some of the others.
Oh yeah, as do some of the others, Irene said. Some of the others are coherent and sane also. I don't mean to generalize too much. But some people might ask, I think it's a valid question, how do you know it's Merlin? How do you know it's not just your own vivid imagination, you know, or some deeper level of creativity that you've tapped within your own consciousness that enables you to conjure up vivid scenarios and all kinds of information, and that it's not really coming from some ascended master or something, it's just coming from the source of all knowledge that you've kind of stuck your toe in?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. There are really two different answers to that. The first answer, probably the more important one, is that ultimately it doesn't matter, because whatever is happening is effective, right? So, and
Proof
in
of the
basic,
pudding.
in the basic training, I tell students, you know, we have a pretty out there background story, and I have no attachment to them believing the story or, you know, getting on board with it. What's important is that they're going to get these healing tools and that they're going to work. Okay. The other, well, sort of the other aspect of that is that what happens in the classes and what students are able to do and what I'm able to do on a personal human level, I wouldn't have the power. You know, just talking about power, with this lineage, you know, has this incredible power in it to do healing, to do earth work, to do all kinds of stuff. I mean, at a very simple level, like in the articles written about vortex healing, I'll take a musical instrument and in 20 seconds the sound of it has changed. I've even, you know, done the test in a sound lab. I wouldn't have a clue. I have a genetic kink called Gilbert's syndrome, which makes the bilirubin go very high. And I have all of my old medical readings. The bilirubin was all over the place. And then I got a transmission from whatever the source of our lineage is, and to be able to work on the genetic level. And I used it. 2 months later, went back, had my blood retested, and my bilirubin had dropped right to the high end of normal. Now, I wouldn't have a clue how to target, change, what genes, you know, it's just, you know, that there's just no way that this human form would have that. Now, of course, you know, if I were tapping into, you know, the universal everything, and, you know, anyone, in a sense, can tap into the universal anything, but again, we come back to the idea of power. So somehow whatever that universal everything is being structured in a way that it's coming through my system would have been developed to be able to play a specific role, to be able to pass that through in a structured way so that people could receive that and then do stuff with it. Now the Merlin that we're talking about anyway is not the Merlin of, you know, King Arthur. It's a divine expression. You know, it is the source. It's a particular flavor of the source. You know, it's the source that is you know, this divine magic. And when you play with this, with vortex healing, you can feel the purely magical quality of it. And that magic, one of its names for it is, you know, is Merlin. So it's sort of like that. You know, I'm not talking to, you know, the person that, you know, was hung out with King Arthur.
but the Merlin you refer to is a conscious, sentient being of some sort, just not a human being, and a being with much greater field of influence?
No, I don't use the word being.
Okay. It's an impulse of intelligence, you could say?
Well, it's like Amma. To me, Amma isn't actually a being.
She is, well, yes and no, right? At the same time?
Well, there's a human beingness there.
Yeah.
But what's inside of that, to me, a being has a boundary, right? And if you look in her eyes, there's no boundary there.
Right.
You know, it's all there, and there's omniscience, and there's omnipresence, and, you know, and I've had all these personal experiences with her, to know personally that that's real, that she's the real deal that way.
Yeah, I have to.
And so um, um, for me, I get the exact same thing with Merlin.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's that quality, the same quality of omnipresence and, omniscience and, and power. So there were some Neem Karoli Baba devotees that went to darshan with Amma, and then afterwards they went off and they were sitting on the side, way out of earshot. And the way Baba used to do darshan was he would throw fruit at people. And so one of them asked the other, how was your darshan with Amma? And he said, well, it was very nice, but it wasn't the same as Baba's. And that moment, Amma picked up a banana and threw it at him. And what she was showing was that at that level, especially, it's just all one. She wasn't any different than Baba. She was just taking a different form. In fact, earlier in her life, she used to manifest as Krishna. And then, see, different forms, though, have different flavors. It's like it's all divine, and yet it's unique. So as Krishna, she realized she couldn't help people as much as she could as Divine Mother, so she started to do Divine Mother instead. So it's the source, and yet it's this expression of the source that has this uniqueness. And the Merlin, which is just a name, it's the Merlin lineage, though. It's the name that became the name of that lineage, because when that lineage got started, it was the word that most represented that quality of magic, of divine magic. And in the language where it started, which was somewhere in the UK way back.
Yeah. Well, since you mentioned Neem Karoli Baba, and since you regard him as one of your primary influences, and since you never met him in the flesh, and also since many people have experiences with him, with Ramana Maharshi, with Jesus, with Padmasambhava, with all kinds of masters who were once living and no longer are, and some of those experiences are very vivid, and some of them happen to people who had never actually heard of that person, such as Ramana, and they have a very clear experience, like he shows up in their bedroom, and then maybe a year later they're in a bookstore and a book falls off the shelf and there it is, his face on that book. So what is your explanation of the mechanics of that kind of thing? Do you feel like these beings have just ascended to a higher plane and are still intervening in human affairs and helping people's evolution, or what's going on?
Well, for me, Ramana was a human being like you and me, and he reached a certain level of evolution. And whereas, again, beings like Baba and Amma and the Merlin, that's the source of our lineage, I don't think of them as beings. I think of them as divine expressions.
Avatars.
Avatars, right. And that's what I mean by avatars. It's just an expression, unique expression of the divine. And a being like Ramana, who's just totally cooked through, becomes one with that. There's no separation. And so to me, it's the one, which is omnipresent, and this is all a dance of that. And and that everything that's happening is that. Everything is, there are all these little events that happen to us that we don't notice. For example, when I had gone back into studying to get into to go into a master's program in computer science, I got so overwhelmed at some point, just absolutely overwhelmed, and I decided I couldn't do it anymore. And this was before I actually got in. I was just preparing to get in, and I started to collapse into this armchair. And in the process, from where I was standing between there and when my butt hit the chair, suddenly there was this little twinkling of light over my head. It came into my body, and by the time my butt hit the chair, my mind had been changed. It wasn't even that there was a dialogue that I was aware of. It just changed my whole consciousness, and suddenly I was excited about doing it. I was, determined to do it. I mean, complete 180 degrees. It just came in and changed it. And the beauty of that for me, and the power of that, was I realized that happens all the time. It's just it happens in much smaller ways that we just don't notice. And so to me, this kind of stuff is happening, continuously, just in differences of degree.
So what do you think that twinkling was? It's like Tinkerbell, or I mean, there's just. Do you think that there was some? I mean, I have friends who see angels all the time around people, routinely, just matter of fact. They don't make a big fuss of it because it happens all the time. And those angels seem to be, or whatever they are, some kind of divine celestial beings, seem to be really working on people, hovering around them, in
Right.
some guiding them in some way. So do you feel like it might have been that sort of thing?
I don't know the source of that twinkle, but to me it all comes from the one, so it wouldn't.
Well,
it wouldn't
everything
matter.
comes from the one. If we're going to
Right,
say
right.
that, then it just kind of turns the whole thing into a homogeneous soup. But
Well, no, I don't want to turn it into a homogeneous soup because I appreciate the uniqueness of the difference between like Baba and Amma. I've never pinned down, which, let's say, unique expression of that,
Yeah.
created that twinkle. But, I know that, Amma, Baba, Merlin, they've all been with me all along, and so, it could have been from any of them.
Yeah. I don't want to spend too much more time on this, but since we're on a roll, I just want to hash it out one more bit. You may remember from the Star Wars movies how Yoda said at a certain point that if he died, he would become much more powerful. And then he did, and then he did. And so you kind of wonder whether these beings who were quite profound in life, having dropped the body, have kind of continued to play a role, but have actually are in a place where they can actually play it much more powerfully and much more universally. Like right now, for instance, Amma's probably in India or someplace, and she's doing things, and she's busy, and she's giving darshan, and I doubt that she's listening to our conversation, although I have friends who think that she's that omniscient, but I have my doubts. Perhaps when she drops the body, there will be a much broader overview and ability to sort of zoom in and intervene here and there in human affairs. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I knew a devotee who had this horse accident, and as he's falling off the horse, he has this vision of Amma catching him, which he thought, prevented him from having worse injuries. He found out later that right at that moment, Amma was walking across a field in India with one of her swamis, and turned to him and said, "One of my children just had an accident." So for me, Amma actually has that level of omniscience, and in the body or out of the body, for her it makes no difference. Now, there are other avatars that aren't as embodied, you might say, as Amma is, and it doesn't take away from their power, but it takes away from the level of omniscience that they might have in the body.
Right.
And without going into names, where more of that kind of omniscience goes in and out, where Amma for me and Baba, someone would walk into Baba's room and he'd look up and say, go write your brother and tell him not to buy that red car. Right? I mean, not even one of his own devotees. I mean, it's just it's just absolutely mind-boggling. To me, it's not that they have more power when they're gone. I actually, early on, I had a sort of, you might say, a prejudice that the opposite, because I had broken my right clavicle, and then when it was fixed, they actually overlapped the bones and tied them, which shortened them, but I didn't know this. And I always felt like I didn't have enough space there, and then a chiropractor one day told me the bone was a lot shorter than the other side. So I thought of getting one of these bone stretching, operations that really break the bone, growing it, and I asked Baba inside if I should do that, and I got that he was going to make it grow. Well, he was called the Miracle Baba, but he was no longer alive. So, I thought, well, okay, we'll see. 2 weeks later, they were the same freaking size.
Interesting.
So, but he could have done that while he was alive, no problem. I mean, he turned water into gasoline and whatever, It was one of the stories in the Miracle of Love book.
Interesting. All right. Well, that's a whole thing we could spend a whole interview on, is miracles and, avatars and all that. But we have a lot of ground to cover here. So let's keep moving.
Well, along the
Yeah.
ideas of what we were talking about, here's an interesting idea that doesn't get brought up, I think, often enough. Around the whole kind of separateness, oneness thing, which is that, someone wakes up and they wake up into the oneness of everything. And yet, when they do that, even though everything is connected and they've woken up into the oneness of everything else doesn't wake up as well.
Right.
And so on the one hand, everything's connected, and yet somehow awakening is still a localized phenomena. It's just, and some of the language in more of the, I think, the Neo-Advaita kinds of circles, sort of ignore that, that whatever that awakening is, it's still a localized phenomena that's happening within a human consciousness. It's, I just wanted to sort of throw that out since we were talking about beings and separation and stuff.
I think that's really important. I mean, as you were aware, there's a sort of a school within Neo-Advaita type of person who, says, well, you're already awakened, you're already enlightened, and therefore you don't need to do anything. And if that logic is true, then Hitler was already enlightened, and Pol Pot, and every horrible person that ever walked the earth. So it renders the whole concept of enlightenment meaningless.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And
in
also,
addition,
go ahead.
In addition, one can say to that, even if, because they'll say, well, there's no one really there, so there's no one that can do anything. But really the answer to that is, although there's no one there, that doesn't mean that there's nothing that can be done.
Yes. And as you say in your book, as long as you perceive yourself as being there and as having free will and so on and so forth, act accordingly. Utilize it intelligently.
Right. And free will is moving through us anyway. It's just that the mind attributes it to some local, being person. But, we also, it's that contradiction where, we don't have free will and we do, because what we are is that free will, and it is moving through us. And since it's moving through us, it's like if I were to have a twitch, I would say, well, I have a twitch. The mind owns it. So since free will is moving through the system, the mind just says, well, it must be mine. Who else's could it be?
There's another thing which happens. I interviewed Radhanath Swami yesterday, who's a member of ISKCON and a Vaishnava, and I heard a talk in which he was arguing against the non-dualists and impersonalists, and he told a story about how this impersonalist came to a Vaishnava ashram, and he said, well, we're all one. And then that night it was very cold, and the Vaishnava host decided to test him, and he said, well, give me your blanket. He said, no, I'm cold. He said, well, if we're all one, you have to give me your blanket. It doesn't matter. But that's a bogus argument, in my opinion, because on the level of the body, it does matter. That individual body is cold, and even though ultimately everything may be all one, I mean, you could take a diamond and a lump of coal. They're the same thing, but they're different, because they've sort of been manifested differently. Or everything is the same thing, but that doesn't mean you would eat garbage, because it's the same ultimately as a delicious meal.
Well, Ramakrishna said something beautiful as he was sort of in the process of dying. In his later years, and he was an avatar, so he obviously had all this, this oneness experience. He said how wonderful it was to still have enough of this thread of human separateness that he could still have in consciousness to experience his friends as friends.
Nice.
And so it's, it's the people that sort of make it all, one and sort of, universal and sort of ignore the uniqueness of it ignores the uniqueness of the human experience. I mean, this human experience, you and I, in our humanness, having this conversation, is that oneness that's through its own creativity taken this form. This is its experience. I mean, I may say, well, this is my experience. on the individual level, but this is the experience of the one.
Yeah.
And you know, it's a gorgeous experience, and it's created, you know, if one simply just says, oh, it's just one, it's like it ignores everything that's been created by that one, just wipes it out.
Yeah. Timothy Conway, who is the most recent interview that I have actually published on the site at the moment, has a nice model which he calls the three simultaneously true levels of non-dual reality. And one level is the conventional, obvious, ordinary level in which we have problems that need working on. You know, we have environmental concerns and health concerns and economic concerns and so on and so forth, and those have to be sort of given their due attention. And then there's the sort of divine level on which everything is perfect. Whatever happens, it's all perfect and well and wisely put. And then there's the sort of unmanifest level in which nothing ever happened. And they're all true, but each has its own domain, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. Well, if, you know, in the bigger picture, if one allows all the separateness to be just what it is, mm-hmm. and allows the oneness to be what it is, then in the place of freedom, one is free to experience the oneness, because oneness is still is both a reality, but it's also an experience that is happening, reflecting in consciousness. One is free to experience the oneness, and one's also free to experience the separateness, right? I mean, the separateness is there, and one can judge it and whatever, and you know, but one can also just experience it for what it is. Okay, you know, that's the body thinking it's someone being hungry, and one can just simply experience it for what it is, which is, you know, which is that, you know, without, and it doesn't subtract from the oneness. It doesn't, you know, limit the oneness, because that is the oneness experiencing itself as separate, you know, in a form.
Yeah. Good. Well, I think we've pretty much done justice to that point. I guess, well, actually, one more little thing I might throw in is that these people who say that we're all enlightened and everything is one and all that stuff, I think it's largely an intellectual thing. It's not.
Yeah,
it's not actually their experience. I mean, you know, hit their thumb with a hammer, and all of a sudden that idea goes out the window. You know, it's this thumb that hurts. You know?
Well, one thing I've noticed in Neo-Advaita circles is that there is this sort of pseudo-awakening experience. I have my own way of determining our own definition of what true awakeness is, and it's something that has to move through the heart. But it's like they get it on a head level, but it hasn't moved through. It becomes this sort of like pseudo-awakening, and it will seem to them to be true because everything will fit into whatever this reflection is that they've got going in their head, but it hasn't actually gone through. And the place where it actually goes through, it actually just changes everything.
Yeah. Okay, good. So your book is a guided tour of the awakening process, mapping the spiritual journey. I mentioned in the beginning why I like the idea of maps. Do you feel that with this map clear in your own mind, the map you've devised, which we'll talk about, do you feel that it could sort of fit into anybody's spiritual journey? Anyone could sort of relate to it if they understood it well enough and determine where they're at? Or even to any spiritual tradition or religion or so on, that various traditions and religions might fit here or there on the map. There's a second part of this question, but I'll let you respond to that first.
Okay. I haven't seen that map in any traditional religion. It's a universal map, mm-hmm. and I didn't actually devise it. It was more that it was taught to me by the way that the source of our lineage took me through my own awakening process, step by step, and in a way that I could actually, you know, map it, turn it into words. Mm-hmm. So it was taught to me through my own experience that way. Now, what I have seen, the closest I've seen is actually listening to some of Aj's talks, where sometimes he's used, like for instance, we have one level we call O self or zero self, and it's the subtle sense of, you know, the core sense of I is gone, the me is gone, but there's still this subtle sense of self that's really kind of invisible because you've lived. It's like you've lived in that forever, and it has no form. It has no center to it. It's just this background subtle sense of self, and it's only by grace that suddenly you become aware that, oh, that that's not it either, because in that place everything is experienced as self, and in your mind, which is programmed to think in terms of oneness, and that you are that, and so you're experiencing everything as self, and everything as and nothing. There's nothing in creation that won't fit in there, and yet at some point there's this like little twinkle that shows you that too is just another level. And in one video, Aja talks about this subtle perfume of self that still sits in the field that has to be moved through. Very, very similar. And other levels he's talked about at times. I can track that, and the language changes at different levels too. So when people, typically when people are talking about emptiness, what they're talking about is a certain awakening to being consciousness, to universal consciousness. Consciousness has a certain quality of emptiness to it. It's a quality, and so when you're talking about emptiness, usually you're talking about consciousness, but you don't necessarily realize that because, everything seems to be consciousness. But I remember way back sitting in Amma's presence and looking around the room in that state, going, okay, everything's consciousness, consciousness is form, and everything is sort of fitting into that. And then I look at Amma, and I can't get her to fit into that. It's like a hole in the fabric of, everything is consciousness, just this big hole with all this light pouring through. And I said, okay, well, everything isn't consciousness. There's whatever beyond it.
I'm going to be spending the day with Adya in about a month, having a conversation with him and Susanna Marie about this whole idea of no self. And one of the sticking points that I keep getting hung up on is that, it's like every experience. You have to have the experience in order to understand it. You can describe blue to a blind person, or mango to a person who's never tasted one, and thousands of words aren't going to convey the experience. So there's always that. But one of the sort of conundrums is that you come into a room and you say, "Hey, Adya," and he turns his head. It's not like somebody else turns his head, or he's had some health problems. He was having a lot of pain in his body. I didn't feel that in my body. He felt it in his body. There was a sort of a localized experience there. And so it seems to me there's some semblance of a self. I don't understand how there could be a complete falling away of any sense of self whatsoever and still be a living, functioning person. Right.
Well, there's, our consciousness is comprised of both sort of a body-mind consciousness and awareness that sort of sits in the middle of that. For me, the two are distinct, which becomes a problem teaching in Argentina where they don't have two words for it. So in Argentina, I have to use the word clear light of consciousness for awareness. But so you have this whole body-mind consciousness and all this conditioning. You've got all this ancestral conditioning, which was all egoic conditioning. It's all based on separation and survival. And so the body-mind has completely its own unique consciousness. Then you have someone comes in, incarnates into that body. So you've got actually three histories there. You've got the individual, personal, past life, karmic history, and you've got these two threads of ancestral history. And all that conditioning and all that memory all has a sense of self in it. And all the functioning in the system evolves out of all that memory. So the body-mind will still know itself that way. But when awareness wakes up to itself, which is also awakening outside of beyond consciousness, at a certain level, it will still, for instance, experience a sense of self in that awareness. But then as it goes deeper, when it looks for the sense of self for itself, When the awareness looks for the sense of self for itself, it's gone. Now, the body will still have its own sense of itself, right? But the awareness in it doesn't, right? So, when you say, George, George, no matter how awake he is, or Alma, still knows that from the body-mind consciousness, still knows what's being referred to. I mean, my mind, when I use the word self, my mind knows what it means by that, right? And I can talk about it as if it has real, meaning. But if I look inside for the sense of self, in the middle of whatever I am, there's no quality of self there. There's just quality freedom, right? And yet, obviously I function. I run this international organization, the Vortex Healing Organization. I teach, answer emails and such. And I can talk about, I felt bad today, or I felt good today, or I had a great golf game, and I root for the Patriots. And I went to see Papaji in India, and his devotees wanted to get him a TV set. He didn't want a TV set, but they wanted to do something for him, so they got him a TV set. So then he started watching TV and got engaged in watching late soccer games, and then was too tired to give darshan the next day, which was funny. And I got to do some healing on him, and kind of got him. He was, he hadn't done darshan for a while because his neck was out and stuff, and I sort of fixed him up. But anyway, one can have all that as an experience. One's still living a human life, right? There's still, freedom living a human life, having human experience. The awakening is still local, as we talked about before. And that life is there to be enjoyed, and for the pain to be experienced, and, for all of that, including, rooting for a team and being hungry and liking a particular flavor of ice cream. It's the unique, incredible experience that the divine is making for itself, and one can do all that and not lose sight of the fact, or lose the connection to the oneness of it all in the middle of it.
Yeah, David Godman, in his biography of Papaji, said that Papaji really hated Pakistan because when India and Pakistan were partitioned, his family lost all of its wealth and all of its property, and a lot of people had like 3 hours notice to vacate their homes and get over to Indian territory, and there was a huge massacre going on in the process and so on. And so when he got a television, Papaji used to like watch the India-Pakistan soccer games, and he'd be screaming and yelling and he had a very, very strong preference for India to win those soccer games. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi once said that Christ never suffered. He said that in the context of an interview by Malcolm Muggeridge with the Abbot of Downside, and obviously it didn't go over too well with the Abbot of Downside. But what he meant was that he was so established in his status as being, an impersonal self, or how you can put a fine touch on the terminology, that the more peripheral experience that his body was going through was not his predominant experience. It sure looked from the outside like he was suffering terribly, but his subjective experience was primarily far beyond the possibility of suffering. Would you kind of concur with that possibility based upon what you were just describing?
I would say that he was suffering and he wasn't. Again, it comes back to the both. Now, sometimes in a teaching situation, one emphasizes one or the other, and I've seen Amma do that. For instance, people have asked her, I saw her once in the same week, 2 different people asked her what happens after you die, and she gave 2 completely different answers. One from the bigger picture, where she says, what happens to the electricity when a light bulb blows out? Bigger picture, nothing happened, no one goes anywhere. And then to the other person, she said, according to your development, you go to a particular realm, and desire, brings you back, basically. So 2 different answers depending on the listener. But to me, essentially, it's both. Because, again, as as the one, established in the one is also that body that's suffering. You know, it's not
Yeah.
separate from that. You know, and again, that's the problem with the transcendent language, is it wants to make it so that this level has no real reality, as opposed to that, you know, that like Ramakrishna, when, you know, asked about that, said, you know, uh, um, it, it's not an illusion. It's just not, you know, it's real. It's just not the way you think it is, right? And, you know, because it's all the divine dancing. It's all has the reality of divinity in it. It's just that it's not. We lay our own frames over that through our perceptions of separation, and then we don't see it for what it is. So to me, he was suffering, you know, and he wasn't. Similarly, like Amma asked about something about her attachment to her children, you know, because
Meaning her disciples.
meaning, you know, all the people in the world,
Right.
and her disciples, yes, you know, and she's, you know, she's as detached as one could imagine, you know, she's the Christ, you know, and she said, I am completely attached to my children. Right? So it's both there at the same time, you know,
Oh, yeah.
suffering and suffering.
A friend of mine was in a little group of people saying goodbye to Amma in the Boston airport one time as she was about to fly off to someplace. And, you know, they were all standing there, oh, Amma. And she was, you know, getting ready to, I think this was before 9/11 when you could actually go to the gate and see somebody off. And she, you know, she was about to get on the plane. She turned around and my friend said she just burst into tears, like she was, you know, just so moved by having to leave these people whom she loved so much.
Yeah. Right, exactly. Exactly. It's complete. It's only when we have complete detachment that we can actually have complete engagement. Because otherwise what we're really engaged with is ourself. You know, a lot of what goes for intimacy is really just people feeling themselves very deeply, as opposed to actually, for instance, really connecting to the other person, or it's this codependent kind of merge that makes you feel very close, but it's all wrapped inside of, you know, an egoic bubble.
Would you say that in people's subjective experience, relevant to this whole point we've just been discussing, there's kind of a ratio situation where, you know, like some people might be 99% locked into individual body consciousness, localized ego, with some flavor of impersonal, transcendent unboundedness. And just to make a long question short, other people that might be reversed, where it's 99% the unboundedness with just, there's actually a term in Advaita called Lesha Vidya, which means faint remains of ignorance. And it's said that that's necessary in order to function. So that with some people it might be 99% with 1% faint remains that enables them to appear and function as a human being in the world.
Yep. I like to think of, and come back to the idea of a map, you know, that there are these levels of awakening, and, you know, you think of that as sort of the vertical plane, so you can go deeper and deeper and deeper into truth. But you haven't, to borrow a term from Aja, embodied that necessarily. So you can get someone who's just had basic awakening and is really very living it. They're really living from that. They're very embodied at that level, and they will most likely come across as a more pure being than someone who's actually awakened much deeper but hasn't done much embodiment. So there's sort of this horizontal movement of embodiment, and there's this vertical movement of deepening. And so, for instance, in our lineage, you know, what we can do is we can keep taking people deeper, but we can only help them to embody so much, because that's something that really people do in their own lives. It's, you know, it's really a process and a practice. You know, awakening happens in a moment, but the embodiment process is the rest of one's life.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that kind of just the process of living automatically is conducive to embodiment?
Oh no, I would say the opposite.
Well, I mean, once there has been an awakening to some significant degree, you get out there and start you know, dealing with life, and it throws all kinds of things at you, and that
Okay,
that
right.
tends to integrate and stabilize the awakening.
Right, but so the awakening happens, and then life throws all this stuff at you, and you've got all these sort of reflexive, all these old conditioning patterns.
Yeah.
And the easy thing, which is what I see most people do, is they just actually they deal with it from there. But their relationship to it has changed. I mean, this to me the most bizarre paradox of awakening is that everything changes and everything remains the same. You know, so when it first happened to me, I was very confused because it didn't meet any of the expectations I had of what awakening was. And, you know, everything, all the mental patterns were the same, you know, the thinking patterns were the same. And yet in the middle of that was this other place of just this pure beingness that changed the relationship to all those other patterns and created more freedom in relation to them, but they were still there. You know, what I liked before I still liked. What I reacted to before I still reacted to, and yet it wasn't real in the same way, you know, that it was before. You know, there was some I sense that was missing from it. And so, so I like to think of it sometimes as this window, this clear window that gets created in the middle of this sea of conditioned consciousness. And then, depending on whether you keep yourself at the window, that window keeps growing, or you know, you sort of get distracted by all the stuff that's going on around the window, and you know, people can act as if they have no awakening at all. And you know, we've seen that in some people who, you know, who you look at them and you know, he's obviously not acting like he's awake, but yet, you know, I can see he's awake. You know.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost the rule rather than the exception that well-known spiritual teachers end up misbehaving you know, in some way or another, and get
Right.
caught with their pants down, literally. And it's confusing for people and quite disillusioning for some
Right.
when this sort of thing happens. And perhaps we should address that just a little bit more, the idea that one can have had a genuine awakening. And maybe you could also consider with us whether their awakening was as ultimate as they may have thought it was, hence the behavior. Had it really been a more mature awakening, then there wouldn't have been a problem. But they can be very charismatic and very brilliant and clear, and even sort of have darshan effect when people come into their presence, and yet still quite a few screws loose.
Right. Well, for me, again, it's the embodiment issue. It's not the profoundness of the awakening, but the way that gets embodied. I mean, one can have the deepest possible awakening where it all just becomes divinity, and it's this dance of divinity, and there's nothing but that. I disappears, me, self, it all disappears, and it's just nothing but that. And then, you know, one starts to shine that through the form, except the form's got all this stuff in it, right? And all this temptation and desire and ego habit, and you know, and so to me, it's not the maturity of the awakening that creates that, you know, pants down effect. It's the lack of the embodiment of it, and sometimes it's the lack of simply commitment to you know, to living from truth, you know. So for instance, something may happen where, you know, I have to make a decision about something, and, you know, all my desire wants to do one thing, but truth says, you know, no. You know, so, you know, right there, you know, what's my commitment to truth? You know, so there's awakening in the middle of all that that has nothing to do with that, you know, in the sense that it's just freedom experiencing itself. But here is an event, and, you know, there's a truth coming through the awakeness, you know, but how committed is the actual human personality, you know, to following that truth versus, you know, indulging in whatever's arising.
So what you're implying is that there's not necessarily a very tight correlation between awakening and behavior, or awakening and the sort of the relative purity of the human personality.
Right.
And for instance, some people were very perplexed that Nisargadatta was a chain smoker. You know, how could he be a chain smoker and be actually addicted to a narcotic if he was awake?
Right.
So if you were to, I don't know if you use the word enlightenment, but if you were, or in your sort of worldview of things, do you conceive of a sort of a superlative state, which we might, you know, term enlightenment, in which there really wouldn't be a problem anymore on any level? In other words, both the awakening and the embodiment have evolved to the extent that one is sort of functioning ideally, if I can use that word, on all levels in an integrated way.
Right. Well, someone like Ramana would represent that. You know, his awakening, you know, was as deep as probably a human awakening can go, and you know, and he embodied it. Excuse me. But he also, you know, was living in a cave. He had
Right.
a lot of time to sit and just embody, and you know, and he wasn't being bombarded by, you know, what we're bombarded by. You know, so much easier situation to embody in, and yet also through that, you know, is able to set an example of, you know, of what that actually means. But there's also an interesting thing that happens at a certain level when the awakening, or some combination of the awakening and the embodiment, goes deep enough that, you know, it's like they both become one in a certain way, where both awakened behavior and unawakened behavior at a certain level just becomes, you know, whatever the divine is doing in that moment, right? And that's not to be used as an excuse, you know, for unenlightened behavior. I'm just saying that you know, like from the larger picture, it doesn't really matter whether someone wakes up or not. It's, you know, an unawakened, you know, human form and an awake human form are equally expressions of the divine.
Yeah, sure. I mean, everything's an expression of the divine. But when we want to speak of awakening or enlightenment, we're referring to a specific thing. Irene just passed me a note reminding me that I once asked Amma about gurus misbehaving, and she said they couldn't be enlightened then if they're misbehaving in these ways. So perhaps in her nomenclature, enlightenment
Right.
does have some kind of superlative value,
Absolutely.
you know, really high value.
Absolutely. No, because, I mean, for her, remember, she didn't come to anything through human awakening.
Right.
You know, she came in completely being absolutely awake from day one. And so for her, you know, awakeness much more is that. And so, you know, so she herself is sort of her own sort of ruler for, you know, for what true
she sets the
awakeness
bar
is.
pretty high based on her own experience. Yeah.
Right, right. And it's almost impossible for a human being, you know, to reach that. And at the same time, it doesn't matter. You know, one has to, you know, keep that perspective as well, because people in the awakening field, so to speak, can get very agitated about their own, that they still have stuff, right? They literally get very disturbed that they're not, that their awakening hasn't purified them, and you know, and that just generates more conflict and more survival. And so the place where one can see that having unawake behavior is also an expression of divinity, and that it's okay, you know. You know, one doesn't want to create suffering for other people, but that just that, you know, that there's a space to accept all that in,
Yeah.
you know, and see that it's part of the perfection.
But you have to be a little careful with that, because people have
Absolutely.
have used that it's okay
Absolutely.
thing as an
Absolutely.
alibi for all kinds of egregious
Absolutely.
behavior. Yeah.
Absolutely, it's a fine dance in language.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, I mean, you know the story. I mean, people have done all kinds of crazy things. Oh, it's just the divine functioning through me.
right, right, and that's of course just disconnect.
Yeah.
But you know, it's hard. It's, you know, so one needs both. You know, one needs to both be responsible for one's actions, knowing one's doing the best that one can, and also, you know, to be able, because if you can't accept wherever you've, quote, misbehaved, then you're just also in struggle, which then prevents you from getting to a place where you're not going to misbehave.
Yeah.
Right? So, because the struggle is going to manifest both sides of the struggle. It's going to keep the other thing alive.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to keep the place that is the resistance to the place that's misbehaving is going to actually hold that in place and keep it alive. So it's really a fine dance.
Yeah. You talk about, well, there's a couple points I want to cover. One is the core veil, and another is grace. You talk of basic awakening as losing one's core veil, so we need to talk about that, losing that core sense of I in the heart. And another is that it takes grace as well as effort to get more awake. So in what order would you like to cover those points?
Well, we should start with the core veil.
Okay.
So, so if you look at, if one has the psychic ability to be able to just look at people's consciousness, and one looks at their I thinking, at their thinking, and looks at the sense of I in the thinking, if one were to track where that goes, where it starts from, it actually starts from the heart. So there's this original point of I in the heart, and if one tracks one's own sense of I, it should go to the heart. There's this I sense in the heart that people, before they wake up, have. And when I first became aware of this, I was actually sitting with Amma, and I asked inside, I asked her, what happens when this goes, when this I sense in the heart goes? And I heard her say in my head, I heard she laughed and said, then there's no place left to hide. So I knew at one point I'd gotten very close, that there wasn't much of it left. And very often I'll have a student who's just got this little bit of it left and they can't find it anymore, but I can see that it hasn't gone through. Then I got to a place where there was just this little bit that was left, and I realized that it wasn't up to me, no matter how much I worked, in terms of whether that was actually going to go or not. That if it was in, I don't love to use the word divine plan because it creates a certain kind of structure that I don't really agree with. But if it wasn't in divine intention, let's say, for that to go, then I could sit like that for lives and lives and lives with just a little bit of I left, and it could just sit there forever, right? And then when it went, the difference between, that little bit being there and it not being there was like the difference between when you have like trillions of cells in the body and one of them is pregnant suddenly. It's like that one cell changes and everything changes with it, right? It's just shocking how one cell can change the whole functioning and consciousness and everything of the system. So in the same way, it's like that. Now I've seen where someone can go into an altered state and not be able to find their I. I had a student who had gone into this state, and so you imagine writing the word I on a balloon and expanding the balloon bigger and bigger and bigger. You get to a place where you can't see the I anymore because it's all gotten thinned out by the expansion of the balloon. And when I talked to this woman, she'd been in this place for at least a month, in a very stable way. But even though I couldn't see the I in the way I normally saw it, intuitively I knew that it was still there somewhere. And I asked her what she felt, and she said, well, she felt very expanded, which for me is a red flag because awakening doesn't feel like expansion. Expansion is an ego state. Something has to expand, and the only thing that can expand is the ego. And so finally I found what was going on, and I did a little work with her, and she was very close to awakening, and we just moved that last piece. And suddenly that whole thing collapsed. And I asked her what she felt now, and she said, well, nothing. And I said, well, that sounds more like it. So in basic awakening, you awaken out of that I, but you haven't yet awakened to what you are, right? So it's this very confusing state, actually, because you haven't, it's like you don't know what you are because you haven't quite awakened to that yet, but you've awakened out of something that was and it's gone. And, there's this real schizoid state where you've got this sort of, all this I thinking and this, this I in the head. And then you've got this place in the heart that's just free, except you're still living in the head. And it's, so after a year of that, I'd run into Aja, and I asked him about this. And I said, I've been in this sort of schizoid state, since, for a year. And he looked at me and smiled, and he said, only a year? And he alerted me that, he warned me that the biggest obstacle I would have to, deepening would be my preconception of what awakening should look like, right? And, which was very good advice, because, none of my preconceptions were met.
So with your whole map thing, which we haven't really gone into yet much, and which we won't have time to go through in great detail in this interview, although I'd like to make this a 2-week interview and discuss every single point in detail if we could. But with that whole thing, is there any danger that you're going to instill in people's minds a picture of what awakening should look like that won't correspond to what it actually looks like for them when it's attained? Or do you feel like your map is pretty safe in terms of not creating false expectations?
I think it's pretty safe because, like in the book, I talk about all those expectations and pretty much say to everyone that whatever your expectation is, it's not going to be that. So, I'm working to avoid creating a certain picture. Also, I have different students talk about their experiences, and I quote in the book, and it's all over the place. I've seen where people start laughing, like a child, they just start laughing and laughing. I've seen where people suddenly go into a sense of loss. There was one woman, in the moment that her core veil moved, she realized that it wasn't what she expected. It wasn't what she wanted, because of course it doesn't do anything for the ego. And her first words were literally, put it back. And I said, I can't put it back. It's an illusion you've just seen through. It's gone. And she ended up literally going to bed for 2 weeks and sort of grieve the loss of this sense of I. And then she came out of it as if, none of that mourning had happened, and, was perfectly functional in her, new state of being. So I've seen, it's just all over the place. That's the conditioning. So whatever a person's conditioning is what's having a response, because the awakening isn't responding. The awakening is just awake. What's responding to the awakening and having an experience of that awakening is whatever has been all conditioned in that human experience. And so everyone's different. Everyone's going to have a different experience. And so I actually don't create a particular picture of what awakening should look like, with the exception of that there's this sense of I that disappears from the heart. And at the same time, I warn people that they still have all this conditioning, including conditioning that sort of sits around in different areas of the heart chakra and the physical heart, and and they could lock into one of those issues and have a sense of I through that issue that's still there. But if they go into their absolute core of their heart, that sense of I is gone. And that's the only actual, definitive thing that I say about awakening.
Yeah, I think you mentioned some doctor who lost all motivation when he awoke and ended up in bed for 6 months or something. And,
right, his wife brought him tea.
Yeah, very tolerant wife.
Right. And that's unusual. That's unusual, but it can happen because that's an example of how he hasn't awoken to what he is yet, and yet all of what he was has fallen away. And so, and it fell away profoundly enough that he doesn't have, the conditioning isn't strong enough to just sort of keep him going.
Yeah.
Usually the conditioning is still strong enough to keep people going in whatever they were doing before.
So it's like a no man's land where you've lost the false sense of I, but you haven't discovered what you are yet, and you're kind of in a limbo state for a while.
It can be, but there's also like this sort of core sense of me, and when the core sense of I goes, the core sense of me is still there. It's actually a different awakening movement. So usually there's enough of, of the conditioned sense of I that's still there in the mind, plus the sense of me, plus at a deeper level yet, the sense of self, to sort of keep people sort of in one piece. But, every now and then there's something that just, there's a big enough movement in it that, that there's just a lot of confusion. Confusion is actually more typical than almost any other response because of that dual effect.
Yeah, I have a friend, Francis Bennett. He and Adya gave a talk together in which they discussed this whole thing of people saying they're done. And Francis's joke is, how do you know you're done? Did someone stick a fork in you? But basically, it sounds like basic awakening, as you're describing it, is in a way just you getting to first base, and
exactly.
that you've got your foot in the door, so to speak. But there's a lot more that. So take us there. I mean, you talked about you lost the false sense of I, but you don't yet know who you are yet. Which base would be getting to know actually who you are? Is that third or is that home?
Well, it's more than a foot in the door because, for instance, we have something we call a spiritual heart that sits behind the heart, and it's a certain connection to divinity that sits in our system. But it's like there's a window in it where pure divinity can be accessed, except that it's covered over by this core sense of I. So, so even though it's the first level of awakening, it changes everything. So it's this dual thing of, on the one hand, it's just the first level of awakening, but on the other hand, it's the thing you've spent eons of, getting to, and it opens that door to divinity in your heart, and it feels like your life has started again. It's as if your life has started here again, and now you're on a new process. Before you were on a process of losing that core sense of I, and now you're in a process of embodying that and going deeper. So the awakening to what you are, to me, would be like the third movement. So in the first movement, and another way you can see it is if you're wearing all these layers of sunglasses, and so you can't really see clearly because you've got too many layers of glasses on. So there's whatever needs to be clear to have that first level of awakening. There's a ripening that has to happen first. And that I absolutely disagree with some of the neo-Advaitists that say it can happen to anyone at any time. I would say it can happen to anyone at any time if they're ripe, but if they're not ripe, there's a momentary experience, and then it gets covered back over because it's just not ripe. So anyway, when the core veil moves, it opens the door for truth to come in. And there's something that knows that everything it ever experienced that was through illusion, right? But it doesn't know more than that. In the next level, one awakens out of a certain sense of personal, which keeps you localized in consciousness, right? That sense of personal keeps you localized in consciousness. And that breaks down, and suddenly you awaken to the experience of being consciousness, as opposed to being a someone, right? And then the next level beyond that, you start to awaken to the awareness that's in consciousness. And I call that awareness awakening to itself. And that's the point where, where then you have some ability to sense awareness in everything.
Let me just interrupt you briefly here
Sure.
to clarify something. To me, awareness and consciousness are synonymous terms. So how are you defining them?
Right. So for me, they're not. So you're Spanish?
No. I flunked Spanish in high school or whatever.
So in English, we have two different terms for them. And so to me, consciousness, first of all, it's denser, and it has this quality of reflection, which enables memory to happen. And a big way that the whole sense of egoic consciousness, the whole sense of I and me get created is through this reflection process. And consciousness has this ability to reflect in itself, where awareness is more like this light. And I actually call it awareness being light love. awareness to me is sort of an abbreviation for something that's more than that, which is awareness being light, love, and it just is, and on the light level it just shines, and on the awareness level it just is aware, and there's no reflection in it, right? It's just this isness, that has its own inherent awareness of itself, and that becomes what you can call the clear light within consciousness. That's how we're aware of things in consciousness, because the light of awareness literally lights it up. So consciousness has a certain quality to it, has a quality of emptiness. When people are talking about everything being empty, to me what they're talking about is consciousness. It's things are made of consciousness. Although to me it's really made of structured consciousness. It's not mind consciousness, but the divine adds a certain structure to it out of its own. That'll get more technical, so I won't go there, but we'll just call it, structured consciousness. And where awareness is just aware.
Okay.
It's
so
just aware.
In my use of the word consciousness has usually been in terms of like the unified field, sort of the unbounded, not just the world, but kind of the ultimate reality, the foundation, that which has no limitation, the field of pure potentiality, interacting with itself results in, sequential symmetry breaking and manifestation.
Well, that's true in terms of in terms of consciousness, it is that kind of a field. It's the field out of which everything gets created. It's generated out of it's generated out of awareness in order to be able to create creation. So there's this unified field of consciousness that has both unmanifest and manifest, and yet there is something that moves through that. You can call it divine intention if you like, and there's for me, consciousness is created out of awareness by divinity. So I call consciousness awareness as consciousness. But the moment that, it's like when water becomes ice, it's still the same and yet it's different. It has different qualities.
Yeah.
So when awareness becomes consciousness, it has this different quality, where awareness feels full, doesn't feel empty. Awareness being light, love, feels full, and it feels light, and it feels love. Where consciousness doesn't have the quality of love in it. It just has this quality of space and quality of emptiness, and it has the potential of what's denser. It has memory.
Okay.
And different qualities.
All right. I could ask you more questions about that, and we could spend the next 20 minutes parsing out the subtle distinctions there and the process of manifestation, but I want to make sure to cover as many bases as possible. So have we really nailed what you mean by knowing who you are? I don't think we've done that yet.
Well, so for me, when awareness wakes up to itself, that's the beginning of the knowing what you are. And then it just goes deeper and deeper. So that's still filtered through a sense of self, and it's still filtered through consciousness. And these are all different levels of filtering that awareness is knowing itself through, that eventually need to get broken down. And then there's still a gap between awareness and divinity. And that gap, if you had to put a word on that gap, you could call it mystery. So you might say that there's a mystery at the heart of awareness, and that when awareness dies through that mystery, it wakes up on the other side.
So you may have just done this, but would you say that someone who has completed the process of knowing who they are, can that be put in words? So,
yeah, those were the best words that I probably can come up with for it.
Okay.
And then, of course, there are no words.
Yeah. So when you say divinity, I heard in an interview you gave, you referred to God consciousness, and you said that's very rare and difficult, and it's something that you don't claim to have attained yet, as I understood you to say. So what would God consciousness be, as opposed to self-realization or knowing who and what you are?
So to me, the difference is the difference between the freedom of awareness, and awareness still has this sort of identity of itself as freedom. It knows itself as freedom in some way. And I would say that a human being can't ever fully, emerge into the state that someone like Amma or Baba is in, because there's just too much conditioning there. They can never free themselves from that completely. They can establish themselves in that. But so eventually awareness can die. It's like awareness has to give up its own freedom, has to give up its own awareness, has to die into the mystery within itself. And then that starts to open, something else starts to come in. It's not that awareness becomes divinity as much as that in the place where awareness has died into mystery, that something else starts to come into that. So it's ultimately a takeover, which is the divine taking over form. And so in the journey of this form, that has started to happen, and yet, it'll, I'm sure, be a long way from done by the time that, this form is done with itself, because it's a forever process of so now it's no longer the form embodying something, it's something else that's just slowly taking over the form at that level. It's actually an interesting reversal that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think you would agree that in this whole process, nothing becomes something else. It's just that layers of the onion are removed, and
Yep.
things which were always what they are being revealed or are becoming appreciated. It's not like something new is ever created.
Yeah, I agree with that. And yet there's the experience there's the experience along the path of that there's this awakeness here and there's this conditioning here, and there's this experiential embodiment of the awakeness, more and more into the form. And at the point where awareness starts to die into divinity, the experiential aspect of that feels different. It has much more the quality of just surrender, and over time more and more of divinity simply taking over.
Here's a question that just came in from Suzanne in London, which seems to be relevant to what we're talking about. She said, you just said that there is something that is aware of the loss of the I settled in the heart after the initial awakening. What is that? That leftover witnessing, I suppose, is still individuated consciousness, is it not?
Well, it's just awareness, and awareness is both local and universal. It's one of the paradoxes of awareness, is that when awareness wakes up to itself, it recognizes the oneness of itself and everything, and yet it's sort of localized at the same time, which is why everything else doesn't wake up with it. So awareness becomes aware that in the form, the sense of I has disappeared, and that consciousness is still somehow proceeding as it much did before, except without this sense of I in the middle of it.
When you say divinity or God consciousness, can you give any, I mean, you say that you yourself haven't fully blossomed into that, but do you have a sense of what one's living experience of life would be in that state, day to day and moment to moment? I mean, what is one actually experiencing as one interacts with the world?
All I can really say from the tastes of that, the tastes of the, you might say I've had a momentary taste of, but the tastes are always different than the reality. That's also bizarre, but in that it's just yeah, I don't really have words for it, other than that there's no separation in it, and ego itself doesn't seem separate. You might say, it's just all what is, yeah,
Unity, state of unity.
yeah. And the word unity seems very small somehow. Um, but what it looks like is Amma or Baba. That's
What it looks like if you observe such a person, you mean?
Yes,
Yeah.
right.
But they are
Right.
avatars, you say. And on the note of avatars, Dan from London, London is hopping today, Dan asks, you mentioned that you see, for example, Merlin as more a normal human being that was fully enlightened, or you
No,
use...
no.
No, the King Arthur Merlin, I think he means.
Oh, yeah. He was a
no,
teacher in our lineage.
right, back some hundreds of years ago. A normal human being that was fully enlightened, or you use the word cooked. I think many people will be interested in why you have drawn this distinction, particularly with reference to Ramana Maharshi. Could you elaborate further?
The distinction in terms of with Ramana in terms of being very cooked.
Maybe he means, that, well, he might need to elaborate on the question, but maybe he means distinction between being a normal a cooked human being and an avatar. If that's not what you meant, Dan, please send a follow-up question.
Okay. So, an avatar doesn't start as a person. So you and I, incarnated. We have a history. We have an experience of being a someone, and slowly that someoneness gets broken down, and it becomes more and more, knowingness. Where an avatar, interestingly enough, an avatar, in order to manifest in a human body, it's kind of like they need false ID. They need a focal point, and as an expression of divinity, they don't have a focal point. So there's this level we haven't talked about, which I call the inner veil, which is like the 8th dimensional blueprint for the core veil. It's a just deeper level of, of constructed I. That, anyway, so they don't really have an inner veil, but they sort of create sort of a false one that becomes a focal point for them to just get into a body, to focalize within a body, and then at some point, they drop it. So like Jesus dropped it on the cross, and that became not just that he was crucified, but became this whole demonstration on this enormous level of surrendering ego. And through that, it changed the world. Amma dropped hers when she was a child, and, I don't need this now.
Yeah, and that's the story of the Ramayana. Rama dropped it, he was a young man and he was interacting with Vasishta, and he was depressed and discouraged and he wanted to become a recluse or something, and so he had this conversation with Vasishta, and the whole Yoga Vasishta ensued, which is a massive volume. But then only through that conversation did he sort of realize his true status.
Right, so he woke up through that.
Right.
He had to lose his core sense of I, and then he had to move up through all these levels, deeper and deeper into truth, following, whatever method he was using, or self-inquiry, if that's what he was actually using for that. He kept following deeper and deeper levels of truth until he awoken to what he was. But Amma simply dropped her mask, and there she was. It's a very different scenario.
Okay.
And there's a lot more power. There's a different level of power in that.
So I'm going to skim through some outline of your book here, and as I'm doing that, keep in mind what you want to make sure we cover. But for instance, you have a whole first section where you talk about the fantasy of what people expect awakening to be versus what it actually is. And you have a bunch of expectations that people have, such as the end of all suffering, coming home to self, ascension, the end of all desire, etc. People can read the book to get into the details on those. Then you talked about your magical moment, how when your awakening occurred, and interrupt me if you want to elaborate on any of these. Then you go into a whole section about awakening's aftermath and how there can be confusion afterwards, loss of motivation. We've talked about some of those things, and there's a couple sections in your book about that. And then your next section is the map from above. Divinity has an emanation. Someone who is not awakened deeply but is more fully living from their awakening may seem more awake than the person who has gone deeper but allowed it to move more into the background. I think you kind of touched on that.
We talked about that, yeah.
Yeah, we did. And then there's a section on divinity. Here's a sentence that jumped out at me. Many modern spiritual teachings have watered down the idea of divinity by equating it with awareness or consciousness or beingness, but divinity is much more than that. And you go on to discuss that. Again, interrupt if there's anything you'd like to elaborate on here.
And that's what I was talking about in terms of, that, it's like there's all this sort of human awakening that happens, where the form becomes more and more awake, awareness becomes more awake to itself in the form, and all of that in some way I would put under this sort of term of human awakening. But then there's this gap, there's this infinite gap between all of that and divinity, and it's like awareness looking at its own root. All it sees is mystery, and it has to die into that mystery, and then something else enters in, and it's not a continuum in the same way as the other awakenings are.
Would you agree with the statement that ultimately, if we really get right down to it, all there is God? And there's nothing which can be found to be anything other than God if we see it deeply enough. So the whole evolutionary process is actually moving toward that realization.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So at a certain stage of awakening, one might very much still see oneself as a human being who has had an awakening, and there's a sort of the non-I impersonal dimension to it and so on, but God is not really in the picture at all. And so that has to kind of evolve to the point where we realize where the reality of the situation is realized, which is that there's nothing but God interacting with God.
Right, but here's the danger, is that, for instance, when one awakens to being consciousness, one would look out and say, well, what I used to call God, it's really just consciousness.
Yeah.
Right? And then if one has the grace to awaken deeper, one looks at awareness and go, oh, I used to think it was all consciousness, but it's all just awareness. Right? So whatever I used to call God must be just awareness. But it's not. Whatever we call God was something that's so beyond any of that. So it's just very easy when we first get into oneness states to think, oh, that's it. And it's like whatever that divinity places, it's the word oneness itself is small in terms of what it actually is. It's just so beyond.
Yeah.
It's just so beyond.
I think that alarm bells should go off whenever we catch ourselves saying, it's only just. There's my little blurb on my Skype ID is a line from the Incredible String Band, which goes, whatever you think, it's more than that.
Well, it's like as we start like with this idea of God, which we hold in this sort of complete transcendent place. And then in our search for that, we sort of come to some awakening path where it all becomes somehow more manageable, right? And it gives us the sense that we sort of, know what that is, because we get, as we start to awaken, well, it must be this, because this is what awakening is, and is what awakening is, but we lose that sense of what God really is, and what that divinity really is, which is so beyond and so magical, and so, just everything stops. There isn't room for anything else in that but that.
To me, God is hiding in plain sight. I mean, if you watch the Discovery Channel or something like that, or just go out in your garden and look at a flower and consider what you're actually looking at, and then get a microscope and look at one cell of that flower and look and consider what you're actually looking at. And I mean, a single human cell is more complex than the city of Tokyo, and we have trillions of them, and they're all coordinated with one another. And it seems like a disservice to say, oh, it's just awareness, or it's just consciousness. I mean,
Right.
the word
Absolutely.
just is so inadequate there
Yes.
to refer to the miracle that we're actually completely involved with in every moment of life and taking for granted.
Right. Absolutely. And so, to me, that's the biggest danger that happens in the general awakening sort of dialogue, is that it becomes more about the dialogue of awakening, and one loses sight of that, of just what you've spoken of, the absolute, of
yeah,
what
the
of what's
incredible
really
intricacy and mystery and unfathomable intelligence that's
absolutely.
functioning in every little iota of creation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think a lot of the awakening dialogues lose track of that, which is a shame.
Yeah, perhaps because both the speakers and the audience have not yet come to appreciate that. I mean, it hasn't yet sort of become relevant in their experience. I mean, otherwise they'd be interested in it and talking about it, wouldn't they?
Perhaps. I think also one just sort of gets involved with what one gets involved with, and then sort of forgets. I think there's a lot of forgetting there. Um, you know, one is so focused on one's own awakening that that one sort of enters that territory and sort of locks into it and forgets that there is this whole other space that's beyond human awakening, which is really what human awakening is ultimately about, is the process of moving towards that other space, of actually falling out of human awakening into something larger.
That's one thing I like about Adya is he very much has this ethic of keep going, you know, and it's been said to him a number of times, specifically when he had some awakening. He thought, oh, this is great, this is it, and then it's almost, I think he almost said like a voice came and said, this isn't it, keep going. And he kind of embodies that in his teaching, and I've heard him say that he always feels like he's just a beginner.
Right. Well, I think Aj is a good example even of this, in that, you know, in his early years of awakening, he would never use the word divinity, and if you talked about avatars, he would actually get uncomfortable. um, and then, you know, not that long ago, he started to use the word divine sort of as an adjective.
Yeah.
You know, the world becomes divinized, and then, you know, it's like, you know, it's having to, you know, sort of work its way through his Buddhist conditioning, and then he starts talking about divinity. You know, it's you know, and to my perception, you know, that corresponds with where he starts to actually start to taste that divinity as part of his own process. You know, where before he was in, you know, the field of human awakening, and divinity wasn't a reality for him yet. You know.
You know what? I'll bring this interview to his attention and suggest that he watch it before I have that conversation with him, and you know, maybe it'll be good. You know, something will come out of that. We got a clarification from Dan in London. You know, where I asked that question, we weren't quite sure what he meant. He said, "Apologies. I meant, why does he particularly reference that Ramana Maharshi is a normal human being and not an avatar? I think people will be particularly interested in why he sees Ramana as a normal human being that was enlightened, whereas other beings such as Neem Karoli Baba as avatars." I asked this specifically because Rama is held up as such a shining example that I think people will be interested to understand.
Right. Well, Ramana, it's just Ramana wasn't an avatar.
You just
he
know
was,
that. You just happen to know that.
Yeah, one can.
Well, he said he wasn't, right?
Right. Well, so if you look at like, let's say you're looking at Papaji on a video and you're looking at Neem Karoli Baba on a video. If you look at Papaji, what you see is that everything has gone to the heart and just surrendered. And there's just this surrender through the heart. If you look at Baba, there's no surrender there. There was never anything there to surrender, right? There was never a center, right? If you look at Ramana, if you look at a picture of his eyes, you go through his eyes into his heart, and into his heart you go out into everything. But if you look at Neem Karoli Baba or Amma's eyes, you can't. It's just they're already everywhere. There's no structure to it. You know, human awakening has a structure to it, and it ends up going through the heart. So, you know, so for someone that can see, it's very clear that Ramana Maharshi, you know, was a human being, and beings like Amma and Neem Karoli Baba, weren't. It's just, it's like night and day. And Ramana is held up because as a human being, he's gone into such a pure state of being transparent, of being surrendered into that it becomes sort of a model for for all of us humans.
All of us schmucks. Well, that brings up an interesting question, a little bit challenging, and that is that there's a number of things that you say in your book where you see things. You see what state a person is in. They're on the verge of awakening. They just awakened. You see something that you call karma knots, which I'd like to talk about, and you can tell how many karma knots people have. I don't know how much you want to talk about what sort of perceptual abilities you have, but maybe a question to start with to let you off the hook a little bit is, would such perceptual abilities be just sort of an aptitude, the way an athletic ability might be or something, and not really core to what awakening is? And one might be very highly awakened and yet not have developed such abilities.
Absolutely. It's just an aptitude.
Something you were came in with.
Yeah, it developed out of all that starvation and the way my nervous system got realigned and being out of body, and
okay.
And then I lived in Tucson, which has a very dry electric field, and good psychics I knew were better psychics in Tucson. Don't everyone move to Tucson, though.
Yeah, and don't starve yourself. There could be like a couple hundred people now that's going to stop eating and move to Tucson.
Anyway, so it just at some point started to come on, and I didn't know if it was real or not, and I would say something like, it looks to me like this, and people would give me feedback, and I realized I was actually seeing stuff. And then it just, as I was a full-time healer, and so I would sit all day, and I would just be looking at human energy systems and looking at things moving through the human energy system, and so I'm staring at it all day, and you get attuned to it.
Yeah.
And so it developed, and in the beginning I probably used more my third eye, and now it's more just, I just see it. It just arises in consciousness, and sometimes I just know. There's a knowing that comes in, and Merlin will help me to tune into stuff, and but it's absolutely not a necessary thing for enlightenment at any level whatsoever.
Right. Just something you've done a lot of, and so
and I'm in the work that I do, which was first as a healer, and and now teaching vortex healing, and running the being responsible for the lineage. It was both an aptitude that I would have needed. So if the intention was for me to be in this role, the divine made sure that I had the qualifications I needed to do the role well.
Yeah.
Kind
of. Like if you were going to be a professional violinist, you would want to have a good ear for music and maybe perfect pitch, and so on. So you'd need those particular skills. So I mentioned karma knots a minute ago. I was just reading about those last night in your book, and I found that very interesting. Describe what you mean by that.
So these are really important, especially before awakening, because as a karmic incarnational being, we have issues. We have incarnational issues that we carry from life to life, and when we come into a body, all of that past life information gets downloaded into the spine, into what we call the karmic body, and they take the form of these knots. And the way I first learned about these karma knots was reading Mother Mira's book, and she talked about these lines and these knots that she unraveled, and I went into meditation with Neem Karoli Baba, and I said, what are these? What's she talking about? And he came in and blew out a karma knot, and I realized in that moment that what these were the center of our karmic issues. Now, those karmic issues have conditioned all kinds of stuff in our system. So, you blow out the karma knot, it doesn't, necessarily radically change, whatever that issue is in the rest of our consciousness, but where I saw the power of it was with an autistic child I worked on, and who didn't have all that conditioning because he was still very very young in his mind.
He's like 9 years old or something.
He was 9 years old, but emotionally he was more like a 4-year-old, And I could see he only had 3 karma knots left. Like a typical human maybe has like 245, and a typical person who'd be watching a program like this maybe has anywhere from a low amount to probably not more than 75 at this point. Because you don't wake up before you lose all your karma knots.
You do not. So
you don't.
So that you have to have 0 karma knots before you can wake up.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And so, like with this autistic child, I saw that that this one karma knot was connected to his autism, and had to do with avoidance of humanness. And I could see that in his last life he had been this like out-of-body meditator, kind of thing, and this was an issue for him, all the stuff he was avoiding. And so I didn't have vortex healing then. I worked more directly with, divine beings like Baba, and we moved this karma knot. And I told the parents that more than likely they were going to see some changes in his behavior over the next few weeks. And over the next few days, it was unbelievable. He was afraid of heights. He started climbing fences. He was afraid of dogs. He wouldn't go into a room next to a room a dog was in. He started going up and petting dogs. Just things like this. He got socialized enough to be able to play in the school band. His behaviors, people started asking if he was becoming normal, who knew nothing about this treatment. And he was, to whatever extent he could. And it was all because of the power of this one karma knot. You could really see how that really held this issue in place. So that's what karma knots are. They hold our karmic issues in place. And at the center of a karma knot is just pure separation consciousness. And I don't tell people anymore how many karma knots they have, because
oh shucks, I was gonna ask.
It created this whole drama.
Yeah, hey, I've got less karma knots than you, buddy.
Exactly. And so I stopped doing that in class. And anyway, in our vortex lineage, by the time people have taken their 3rd class, all their karma knots are all gone anyway, so it all equalizes out.
By 3rd class, do you mean 3rd series of classes, or
No,
3rd actual meeting?
The 3rd class, yeah.
Well, that's kind of remarkable, because you say that, traditionally people might be lucky if they release 1 karma knot per lifetime, usually when they're dying, and that people who spend a life meditating in a monastery might release 1 or 2 or something like that. And now you're saying that somebody who might have 100 or 60 karma knots is actually going to be able to release them in 3 classes.
Well, 2 things. One is we live in a much more accelerated environment. So when I first started to teach vortex healing, people would lose 1 or 2 in that first class, and it seemed like an amazing thing, where now, they'll lose, 13 or more. And that's just the whole acceleration of the planet that we're living on. It's not just how many karma knots I can move in someone else, it's how much they can process of that kind of movement. And the acceleration, that's what it really shows me, the acceleration of humanity is that change over the whatever number of years I've been teaching, 13 years or something, in terms of what even happens in just the first training. The second thing is we don't have people with 150 karma knots in our class. By the time someone's interested in our class, I don't think we're going to see someone with more than about 60.
Uh-huh.
And
but still, if that autistic boy only had 3 and you removed 1 and it made that big a difference in his behavior, right, what must it do to a person's life to remove 60 in 3 classes?
Well, again, as non-autistic people and as adults, we have a whole lot more conditioning. So it's like if you think of a tree and you suddenly cut off the root of a tree, that tree is going to die, but it's not going to die. Its leaves aren't going to fall off the next day. So you've released the root, but all the stuff has grown out of the root, and all that stuff is conditioning in the mind, and you've got all this ancestral conditioning in the body. So the effect of that karma knot is going to be different for different people, including losing 60 of them. But it's even rare to have people with that number of karma knots. You know, one of our classes, someone just isn't interested in the kind of accelerated movement that we have until they're closer, you know, further along the line.
Yeah. So, so you said number one that people who take your classes get rid of all their karma knots, and you're kind of almost making that sound like a guarantee, like it always happens. I'm not sure.
Always happens.
Always happens. Okay.
Always happens.
And then, I mean, and then you've also said, I believe, that you know you have classes typically in which everyone wakes up, everyone gets through the core veil.
Core veil, right? It's preposterous.
To say such a thing, you mean? Yeah.
I mean, when it was first presented to me by, you know, Merlin inside that we were ready to do this on a group level, because in the beginning I'd have these classes and one or two people would lose their core veil in the class, and which would create the same kind of drama. You know, people would say, "Oh, why them, not me? You know, I'm more evolved than they are." People would resent them. It was really
obviously they weren't quite ready if they had those sorts of attitudes.
And then something happened. I won't go into the details about it. Where suddenly we would be able to do that for everyone, and I just didn't see how it was possible. It seemed absolutely preposterous to me. But the core veil is created by this reflection of I in the heart. You know, it's like the I keeps remembering itself, and that's how it keeps itself going, right? So if you can hold the heart still enough for long enough, and then sort of have an extra little push from the other side, that core veil is going to go. And so we came up with this tool for the class, this energetic consciousness tool that could help to hold the heart still. And through that, we knew we would be able to, you know, move everyone's core veil. Now, of course, we talk about people getting ripe. So all the classes leading up to that class, the divinity in the form of Merlin is getting everyone ripe for that. So there's this series of 14 energetic consciousness movements that where losing the last karma knot is like the number 4, and then there's another 10 that people are taken through that get them ready, get them ripe for where, and that ripeness, there's already like a little hole in the core veil, and it enables us to do that. But I sat with that for a long time before I announced that to the students, because of course if that didn't work, they weren't going to blame Merlin, they were going to blame me.
And so you take them through like these 14 layers in roughly 3 classes, is that what you're saying?
No, there are more classes. No, that's just to lose all the karma knots.
Oh.
And then there's, let's see, 1, 2, 3. There are 3 more classes until they get to that 14th energetic consciousness movement. Mm-hmm. And at that point, after that, they can take the core veil class, and that core veil is going to move.
So if you're batting 1,000 in terms of, you know, removing everybody's karma knots and enabling them to awaken, to have this basic awakening, how come this thing isn't catching on like wildfire?
Well, first of all, I have to clarify, I'm not actually doing anything.
Right.
I'm just sitting there.
Well, the vortex healing is, let's put it that way.
Well, it's divinity working through the group field that's in my system that's there, but I could be reading, I could fall asleep, it wouldn't matter because Merlin's doing all the heavy lifting. Mm-hmm. You know, I just really have to make that clear. I'm actually not doing anything. I just show up. It's as if my system was evolved through this process to be able to be a vehicle for this. And I just show up, and the vehicle is just the vehicle, and, you know, divinity is doing all this work. Why isn't it more well known? Don't know.
I mean, word of mouth would tend to spread something like that if, you know, but exponentially. If
we're not equipped.
If 10 people take a class, they all get rid of all their karma knots and awaken. Then they tell 10 people, that's 100 people right there. And you know, it seems like it would be kind of really taken off.
I have no idea. I know that, you know, we're not equipped to deal with like massive amounts of people coming in. We have like you know, just a handful of teachers, and I'm the only one that can actually, you know, that's been sort of whose system has been evolved to be able to teach the awakening classes. So there are real limitations there in terms of numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And so my sense is just Divinity keeps it at a number where, at this point where it's manageable.
Divinity may have just upped the ante with this particular interview. So I noticed in your website it looks like there's just about half a dozen teachers, unless those are just representative mugshots. But there's a relatively small number like that, right?
Yeah. So it's just like that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and where are these teachers located?
We teach around the world.
Mm-hmm.
We have one teacher, for instance, who lives in Ireland and teaches in the UK and the Netherlands. He's taught some in Switzerland, and we have a couple of US-based teachers. One of our US teachers does more overseas teaching than teaching here. We have another teacher that lives in the UK. And we've had teachers who've lived in other parts of the world as well, and we've taught on most continents at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. And how much does it cost to go through all this training and all these classes?
Let's see. Well, each class is has a different length of days,
mm-hmm.
and we don't have one of those sort of scammy systems where you get in, and then the same number of days later costs you 20 times as much.
Right.
So a 5-day beginning class and a 5-day super advanced class is all the same.
Mm-hmm.
But the basic foundational 5-day class is, well, in the U.S. it's I think it's I don't teach those, so I'm trying to remember. But it's like something like $625, maybe $650.
Uh-huh.
Something like that.
And 5 days means all day long, or just an evening meeting, or what?
No, it's like 9 to 5:36.
Yeah. Well, that's very reasonable. It's like $100 a day, or a little bit more.
Yeah. We've always kept it reasonable, and and the prices, of course, are different in different currencies.
Mm-hmm.
So like right now, the UK price, is cheaper in dollars than the dollar price because the pound has just dropped. And,
right.
That kind. When we have classes in Argentina. The Argentinian economy is different.
Yeah.
Classes are cheaper there, and
mm-hmm.
so we have people who go there and teach. We used to have an Argentinian teacher, but she retired.
Are all these classes taught sort of in a local area and people just commute from their homes, or are they taught in a retreat setting where you just go there and stay there during it?
Again, it's really different. Like I teach one basic foundational class a year at the Omega Institute in upstate New York,
mm-hmm.
and that's a retreat center.
Yeah.
Every other class I teach is at a hotel,
okay.
And people come and they stay at the hotel or nearby or commute.
Mm-hmm.
And overseas, sometimes it's at a hotel and sometimes it's just at a center, but not necessarily with lodgings, and people stay at other places around. So it's a real varied situation.
Okay. What else would you like people to know about vortex healing that I haven't thought to ask?
Well, first of all, our website is vortexhealing.org, mm-hmm. And the book that you were referring to, because we have two books. One is about vortex healing, and the other, which you were referring to, is called Awakening Through the Veils, and just that vortex healing is it's sort of this dual path. On the one hand, it started for me I started as a healer, and it started for me as a healing tool, but it's a divine lineage, and all divine lineages have awakening sort of as its ultimate goal. And so for people more interested in awakening, you can think of it as an awakening path where you have this sort of extra perk where you learn this healing tool as part of the process. And for people who are more focused on healing, you can think of it as this fantastic, healing art that has awakening as sort of this perk.
Yeah.
But they're really intertwined, because in order to give people, first of all, another thing that shows the movement of what happens at a core veil, and the core veil goes, is that the whole energy system goes through a radical shift. So that what the healing tools we're able to give people at that point are completely different than what we could do beforehand. there's a certain movement of what we can release, for instance, in the karmic body, that once someone has gone through basic awakening, suddenly it's like all of that has gotten loose, and there's this whole other kind of movement that can happen there that you couldn't do before. So you see all these different kinds of indications that something radical has happened on the energetic level. And so part of what's happening in the early healing classes is that the system is being evolved both energetically as well as on a consciousness level to be able to have that awakening. That awakening then changes not just consciousness, but changes the energy system itself, so that we're able to then give you different levels of healing tools. And it works like that, kind of throughout the whole system. So they feed each other. They're both separate and yet intertwined. And so like our deepest level of class needs as a prerequisite our deepest level of healing, because those healing transmissions are part of what's evolving the energy system. So someone may be able to have a certain level of awakening through a different path without taking, let's say, that particular class. But for me to create that awakening on a group level, I need to have everyone sort of at a certain level of energetic evolution, to be able to do that as a group. And so, for us, the two go hand in hand.
I don't think I've quite asked, or you've quite said this yet, but if you could give us a whole overview of like how many different sets of classes there are, how many different levels of training and so on, if you were to do the whole thing from A to Z.
I think that, I don't think that would go over very well in terms of just, trying to describe all that. Mm-hmm. I think people are better off looking at that on the website.
Oh, it's there then, okay.
Yeah. So yeah. It's on the website. There's, let's see, 1, 2, 3, there's, just to kind of summarize it though, there's 5 classes before one would take the class where one loses the core veil. In that core veil class, we now actually combined what were originally 3 separate awakening classes, so that awakening, that beginning of awakening to what you are, actually happens in that core veil class.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, is there anything else you'd like to say about the whole thing that I haven't thought to ask?
Well, just that playing with magic is fun.
What do you mean by that?
Well, so the energy we're working with, it's every form of divine energy has a different quality to it, and so this lineage, being the Merlin lineage, the energy has this magical transformational, quality to it, and so when you're doing healing, you're working with this packaged divine magic, and wizards seem to have more fun.
Who does?
Wizards.
Wizards, yes. Yes.
So to speak.
Harry Potter and all that.
But it's very magical. It's I'm still amazed. I'm actually still constantly amazed at what can be done with it. And on a healing level, for instance, if you go to our website and you click on stories and you see all the different kinds of healings that people have just shared, been willing to share, and that we've posted, it's just phenomenal, across the board.
Do people who take the training sometimes go out and just function as healers, as opposed?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's not just something they might go. Not that they go out and represent the whole package in terms of helping people awaken. They might just go out and set up an office and just do healing work. Yeah,
I mean, typically, people who take the class are either taking it because they're interested in healing, either themselves or family members, or they have interest in having a healing practice, or they already have a healing practice.
Yeah.
Or they've come to it through the word of mouth, awakening community, and they see it as a shortcut for them to, to get to awakening. So they come to us through one or the other.
Now, we were discussing earlier how you have a certain aptitude for healing. You're kind of wired that way. It's your dharma. Some people may not. I mean,
yeah, that's a great point.
Obviously, just some people go through the class and just they have awakening, but they never actually acquire any healing abilities.
No, everyone acquires healing abilities from the basic class onwards.
To some extent.
And, well, to a large extent, because even if people can't see, psychically, the way the transmission works is that when they, connect to someone and intend to do healing, all this divine intelligence, and divine energy that's been transmissioned in the system just kicks up and starts working. So we have people that do fantastic healings that themselves don't have any sense of what's going on while they're doing healing. So, and we do a lot of practice in it. So, we get to see in the class where people can't sense, and yet, the person who's receiving goes, wow, that's the most fantastic thing I've ever experienced. It's just, so the ability to actually do the healing is there for everyone who's taking the class, regardless of their, if they're also psychic, that adds something to it, and actually, is going to bridge something in a little deeper as well. But everyone can do the healing.
Sometimes in the Yoga Sutras, for instance, and many other teachers caution against developing psychic abilities or siddhis or other such abilities because they say it may be a distraction. Do you deal with that issue at all?
Well, first of all, I think in the modern world, living in the modern world, I think there's a lot more distractions that one has to be concerned about.
True.
But yes, the thing that makes it more of a distraction is if people start to think of it as their own power,
right,
as opposed to that they're a vehicle for the power.
Ego gloms onto it.
Right, and the ego gets identified with it and all that kind of stuff. And so we address that as best we can. That this is divine power, and you've been given this gift to be able to use this for others and for yourself and so on. And in fact, at the top of at the end of each of our class handouts. For the healing handouts, we have a typical session, what you do with this new healing tool. And the top of it is a reminder, that the healing power that you're working with is not your own, that it's the divine's.
Well, it's all very fascinating. I was going to say this in the beginning of the interview, and I forgot, but I feel it more emphatically even now, which is that, if everything you say is true, and I have no reason to believe that it isn't, then I think this may end up being one of the more useful interviews I've done in terms of both providing an intellectual understanding of the whole range of possibilities, and particularly if one were to read your book, because we weren't able to go into that much detail of that nature here, but also in terms of offering something which has really kind of practical implications and very profound degree of efficacy. I mean, it's pretty tall order, pretty bold claim to say 100% everybody's going to get this, but you're saying it, and
But you don't have to say it.
So, Irene said, but you don't have to say it. Well, I'm just echoing Rick. So it's exciting, and it'll be interesting to see what kind of response you get from this interview, and what kind of feedback you get from people who get in touch and get involved and so on. I'd be interested in hearing some follow-up feedback.
Well, it's been a pleasure being on the show. It's great to have these kinds of dialogues.
Yeah, it's great. Well, I'm very excited. I hope to finish your book and read your other one, because I was really learning a lot from. Usually each week I have a new guest coming up, and the previous guest.
I want to add one other thing.
Yeah.
Is that when people go to see Amma or Mother Mira I don't consider an avatar per se, but actually more like a bridge for an avatar. Or they go to see any other beings like that, and they go up for darshan, or even just sitting in the hall, karmanats are being moved, it takes divine energy to move a karmanat, because the heart of a karmanat is pure separation consciousness, so it needs at least something that's awake, and more efficiently something that's divine to actually just, help that to wake up to what it is, and then it's like this little hole in the center just disappears, gets filled with light. So just that, the more people spend time sitting, with, all of these beings, it's taking them down the path, whether they're conscious of it or not. It's, spend as much time with the divine as you can, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, I've had friends say, well, I went to see Amma, and I knew, I could tell from my token number approximately when my darshan was going to be, so we had a chance to go out and see a movie first, and then I got my darshan, and then after that I had a really good time talking to friends in the other room, and which is really not the whole way to approach it.
No, it's, and just being, see, like when people are sitting, are in classes, I mean, their mind frame is they're in a class and there's a teacher up there, but, again, it's, they're really in Merlin's presence, because Merlin is creating this group field, and it's a divine field. And that's what enables, the work we do. So if you imagine a divine lineage, and different divine lineages have different focuses, like Amma's goal isn't to awaken all the individual beings that come to her, but it's to create more this certain kind of movement on the planet as a whole, right? And it's gorgeous what she does, and to get people to be more like, loving to each other and all this kind of stuff, and she's creating some awakening as she goes. And if your goal is to awaken, she'll do more of that for you because she's going to work with you. So imagine a divine lineage that has as its core intention to actually awaken the individuals that are, there. That's actually its focus, is to create healing and to create awakening. If you really get that context, then the idea of being able to get people to a certain level and being able to awaken them as a group becomes, oh, of course,
plausible.
As opposed to, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, this has been really great. I really appreciate the conversation. I knew I'd enjoy it when I was reading your book, and I did. And I hope that the listeners and viewers did too. So, time flies, and we have to wrap it up. But let's just make some concluding remarks. Do you have any final concluding remarks you'd like to make? Or have we pretty much covered it?
Just not to struggle too much over one's own awakening process, and to take the time to actually sit with the deepest level of divinity that you can inside whenever you have time to do that.
Great. And my concluding remarks are a little bit more mundane, just that this is an ongoing series of interviews with spiritually awakening people, and if you would like to be notified of each new episode, then there's an email form you can sign up on the website. You'll get an email once a week or so. Check out the various menus on the site, and you'll find some interesting things. It's always in development. Donate button, as I mentioned, enables the whole thing to continue. And it's an audio podcast also. In case you'd like to subscribe to the podcast, you'll see a link for that. So thanks for listening or watching. Thank you, Rick. And my next guest will be Sri M., who is generally in India and sounds like a very interesting guy. But you'll hear about him when I interview him. So see you next time.
Thank you, Rick.
You're welcome.